The movie begins in a forest with a sinister appearance, where tall trees block most of the sunlight, except for a few rays that manage to enter. Suddenly, a dirty hand grabs a tree, and we soon see the silhouette of a teenager in a yellow hoodie, running exhaustively. The figure looks extremely tired as it collapses onto the ground. After a few minutes of running, leaning on its knees and arms, while its fingers claw at the muddy ground around it as it gasps for air. In the next scene, we see a red bus driving down a lonely road surrounded by tall trees. Inside the bus, Nolan, a teenager with his gray hoodie up, has his headphones plugged in. Looking out the window as the bus moves forward, we notice a teenage girl sitting in an adjacent seat drawing in a sketchbook. Nolan glances at her and smiles shyly, clearly harboring a crush. The voice on the radio announces a lunar eclipse that will occur soon, and the driver lowers the radio volume before turning to the teenagers asking if they will watch it. Carl, one of the teenage boys, declared CL that he has already seen something on YouTube, and Queenie, the girl next to him, says she will watch it with her dad. The two begin to argue for a moment before calming down after a minute of silence. Reggie, a teenager with a nose piercing who was sitting alone in the back, crushes an empty can and throws it at Nolan, who is in the front, hitting him in the head. When Nolan turns around, Reggie shows him the middle finger, and he retaliates, before turning back to see Bess, his crush, smiling at him. The boys joke around for a minute, and after the motion dies down, Joe asks Bess if she will watch the lunar eclipse when she responds uncertainly. Carl laughs and nudges Queenie beside him, while teasing Nolan and Bess. Queenie, annoyed, abruptly stands up to sit in the front away from the two. The voice on the radio continues to speak about the lunar eclipse and how it will be one of the longest and most fascinating, while Reggie mocks Joe for driving slowly. The bus keeps driving in, soon enters a dark road with tall trees blocking the sunlight. In the middle of the road, there is a fallen tree, but instead of turning back, Joe puts the bus in reverse and turns onto a smaller path, a hidden shortcut among the trees. The bus continues down the path and soon emerges onto an open but desolate road with no trees in life, and a thick fog hanging above the teenagers. Look out the window, scared, as the fog obscures their view as the bus slowly advances. They reach a small road with denser trees than before, and are forced to stop again, due to a dead deer. In the middle of the road, Joe gets off the bus, warning the passengers to stay inside, and begins dragging the animal out of their way. The friends consider helping him before deciding it's not worth it. Joe drags the animal to the trees beside the road and stands up to wipe his palms before something makes him stop. The teenagers tease each other and joke on the bus. While they wait for Joe to return, Carl starts telling a funny story to his friends, but he is soon interrupted by Joe coming back with a gun pointed at his head. The laughter stops abruptly, and all the teenagers have the same terrified and confused expression as they see a worn-looking man enter right after the driver. He greets them threateningly with the gun in his hand, still pointed at Joe's temple, and orders everyone to sit down. Joe urges them to remain calm, assuring them that the man won't hurt them. The man with the gun does not seem impressed by this declaration and shoves Joe, ordering him to just sit and drive without saying anything, directing the order at the teenagers as well. And they all sit quietly, except for Reggie, who stubbornly maintains his posture for a moment before turning to his seat at the back of the bus. The armed man turns back to Joe in the driver's seat and orders him to drive while the doors close. Carl suddenly remembers something while watching the maniac in front. The scene shifts to a few days earlier when Carl was having lunch with his dad, Chris. He was telling the older man a story about how he helped save a girl from bullies at school. And we can see that his dad does not quite believe the story, but allows him to tell it anyway. The story becomes more intense and absurd, but his dad maintains a false expression of surprise and admiration. When he tries to describe how he defeated the bullies, he accidentally spills ketchup on his dad's tablet. As Chris cleans up the mess, we see a news article displayed on the screen with the face of a convicted criminal standing out. Carl asks his dad about it, and Chris tells him about the serial killer who just escaped from prison. He explains that they are doing everything they can to find him, because he is a lunatic who eats tongues and seems to have an obsession with teenagers. Chris teases Carl, telling him not to worry, since he could handle the runaway criminal, just like he did with the bullies at school back in the present. Carl's eyes widen as he recognizes the armed man as the escaped criminal. The day turns to dusk, and the bus continues driving. Pedro orders everyone to throw their phones out of the window so that they can't call for help. They quickly comply, except for Reggie, who stares him down from his seat at the back from the driver's seat. Joe calls Reggie's name and pleads with him to do what Pedro asks, but the dirty man silences him. Laughing maliciously, Pedro strides determinedly toward Reggie at the back of the bus and presses the barrel of the gun against his head, assuring him that the gun is real after letting a slew of curse words escape his mouth. Reggie finally concedes and hands over his phone to Pedro, who snatches it and complains about the teenagers being zombies. He demands they sit down and enjoy the ride while Joe continues driving. Joe keeps driving the bus as it gets darker around him outside. There are signs indicating that they are driving into an abandoned military zone. Nolan and Bessie talk to Carl ahead of them, their ice telling him to knock the gun out of Pedro's hand. But the boy is too scared to do so and shakes his head. They look back at Reggie and watch the gun in Pedro's hand again, and this time, it's Bessie's turn to shake her head in denial. At that exact moment, Pedro looks back, and the two quickly sit up straight, pointing the gun at him. Pedro asks Nolan his name, to which the teenager reluctantly responds. Pedro comments that his name sounds like something from a comic book, and then makes a statement about liking comics when he was a kid, but not in a very friendly way. He recounts that the first thing he stole was a pack of cigarettes and comic books, showing how obsessed he was. The bus remains quiet after that, and they slowly continue driving until they reach a tunnel with bright lights, where they soon enter. Then the engine fails, and the bus inexplicably breaks down. Joe curses loudly, and Pedro stands up, demanding to know what happened. As Joe tries to explain, the barrel is pressed against his head again, and his captor orders him to fix it. The shaken driver turns the key in the ignition several times, but the engine won't start. Pedro becomes irritated and turns to grab Queenie, who is sitting just behind him. The girl squirms and begs not to be hurt, but Pedro presses against her temple and orders Joe to fix the engine if he wants to save her. Joe pleads with him to remain calm, but Pedro just shouts for him to get out of the bus and fix the engine. He warns Joe not to try anything funny and extends the warning to the teenagers behind him before shoving Queenie out of the bus behind Joe, going to the side of the bus with Pedro and Queenie on his tail. Joe opens a compartment under the bus and begins looking with a flashlight. The rest of the teenagers watch from inside the bus, and Carl begins to panic. He tells his friends that Pedro is definitely going to kill them, and Bess says that to prevent this, they need to disarm their captor. Terrified, Carl shakes his head disapprovingly and says it would be too dangerous to disarm him now, and agrees. Joe doesn't seem to figure out what the problem is with the bus and judges that it's an engine issue, something he can't fix. Suddenly the lights go out, and the entire tunnel is dark with the only visible lights coming from inside the bus. Pedro points the gun at Joe, uncertain, while everyone is terrified by the sudden power outage. While they all glance around, a strange noise can be heard coming from the darkness ahead, and they all stop to listen closely. Joe points the flashlight into the darkness, but they can't make out anything. He leans forward and Pedro prods him in the back with the gun before telling him to check what's hiding up ahead. Cowardly, he offers to stay with the teenagers and makes Joe walk into the darkness armed only with a flashlight for aid. Joe slowly advances into the darkest part of the tunnel from where the noise came. Pedro shoves Queenie back into the bus, and everyone watches Joe through the glass. Joe continues into the darkness, and soon a low growl is heard as a huge hooded figure rises. The teenagers behind him begin to panic and scream, while Joe's eyes widen similarly. Whimpering, he starts to shake in fear before letting out a scream as the creature grabs him by the chest. The passengers begin to scream and panic even more. and Pedro yells, trying to keep everyone quiet as they run toward the back of the bus. He orders them to sit down and be quiet, which they do with extreme difficulty. Trying to think of a solution, he reaches for the steering wheel and realizes the key isn't in the ignition. Irritated, he lets out a series of curse words before rushing at Carl. He points the trembling teenager and orders him to go get the key off Joe's body. But before Carl can respond, Nolan stands up and offers to go in his place. At the same time, Bee runs to the front of the bus, and before anyone can stop her, she jumps out. Nolan tries to stop her, but Pedro points the gun at him and makes him freeze. Bee slowly and carefully advances toward Joe, while the others in the bus hold their breath when she reaches what's left of Joe. She crouches, trembling, to put her hand in his pocket to get the key. She looks at his face and starts to cry. But then, a more distant sound in the darkness distracts her, so she grabs the flashlight and turns it on. A sudden movement startles her, and she rushes back into the bus. Pedro takes her key and orders Reggie to start the engine, while Nolan asks about Joe, and with a negative shake of her head, she says he's no longer alive. Reggie tries to start the bus, but the engine won't turn over. Pedro begins to grow impatient and threatens to shoot the others if Reggie doesn't turn on the butts. Immediately, he threatens to start with Queenie, whom he calls Four Eyes. Upset by the insult, Reggie stands up threateningly and tells Pedro to stop referring to Queenie that way. And for a moment, the armed man is distracted. Nolan sees his chance and quickly shoves Pedro, allowing Reggie to grab his gun with the rolls reversed. Pedro steps back for a moment while Reggie points the gun at him. But in an attempt to provoke him, Pedro starts calling Reggie names and tells the boy that he won't pull the trigger because he lacks courage. Something hits the bus and the teenagers get distracted for a moment, allowing Pedro to regain the gun. But this time he points it upwards. While the teenagers begin to whimper and become afraid, Pedro jumps out of the bus and starts yelling for the creature to come out of the darkness soon as plea is answered. And upon seeing the monster, he freezes in disbelief and smiles shyly. A loud crash from outside surprises the friends, and they cluster in the aisle as they hear the sounds gunshots echo, causing the girls to scream and the boys to curse. All panic ensues, and Reggie worsens things by turning to Carl and insulting him. Nolan tries to calm him down, but he tries to fight too. So the girls intervene. The fight is interrupted when a bizarre roar happens just outside the window, and upon seeing the creature holding Pedro's dead body in its hand, they begin to scream and huddle down between the seats. The creature growls and grunts, and the friends realize that the monster's hands have enormous claws that are embedded in the head of the miserable man. After it seems to fall out of reach, they try to figure out how to stay alive. And Reggie, annoyed, goes to sit in his usual seat at the back of the bus. The radio turns on, but they can't understand what the other person is saying. And while they try to listen, Reggie has a vertigo attack at the back of the bus. He stands up and turns to the back window, pressing his hands and face against it hypnotically before falling back into his seat in the next scene. The teams can hear the familiar crunching noise indicating the creature's arrival. They huddle together and turn toward the sound, starting to scream as the bus begins to shake. We see the long clawed fingers of the creature opening the front door and entering while their screams intensify. They run toward the other door, and Reggie tries to force it open. Bess grabs the flashlight and points it toward the creature. This seems to have an effect on it, so they hold it off for a while before the door finally opens and they escape. Bess leads the way toward a door she saw earlier in the tunnel, and they find themselves in a bunker. After walking for some time, they find a room, decide to stay there after Nolan inspects it on a nearby wall. Nolan and Best find a drawing that seems to be the floor plan of a military fortress. They decide that they need to find the control tower to turn on the lights, but Reggie thinks they won't find it. They start talking about Joe, and Reggie tells the others that Joe knew his dad here. We discover that Reggie's dad is in prison. Reggie sadly adds that his dad is innocent and is only serving time because he was framed. Nolan takes the map from the wall and leads the friends, pointing to the control room, and Bess offers to go with him. Nolan is pleasantly surprised, and Reggie wishes them good luck before the two go find the control tower on the way. They have a good conversation. Nolan takes the opportunity to compliment her on her drawings. He tells her about his mom who used to paint, and how his favorite painting is of a blue sea by the ocean. Back in the safe room, Carl makes drum noises and gestures as he lists everything he wants to eat between the beats. Reggie silent as him, but he doesn't hear. And they end up getting into a silly fight when Queenie interrupts the two, saying she needs to empty her bladder, and the boys vote for Reggie to accompany her, allowing Carl to keep making noise while looking for the control tower. Nolan and Bess come across a huge machine that turns out to be a giant spotlight, and Bess comments that the plan obviously didn't work, while pointing her flaming torch toward an inner cave where a dead body lies. Reggie and Queenie walk a bit, but before she chooses a place to urinate, Queenie tells Reggie to turn around and move away from her before she squats down to do what she needs. While busy, Reggie tells her that she looks cute when she's angry, and that he plans to make her angry more often, expecting a response, but getting none. Reggie calls for her, unsure if he should turn around. He eventually decides yes, and realizes that she has disappeared. Scared, he races back to the safe room to call for Carl. On the other hand, Nolan and Bess continue looking around, and eventually Bess calls for her friend with good news. They found the main panel. Reggie and Carl keep running and yelling for Queenie, and Reggie repeatedly blames her. They eventually find her in a dark hallway, screaming underneath the creature that seems to be feeding on her. Reggie bravely runs to her and tries to stare the monster with the lit torch in his hand, enough for Carl to get Queenie to safety. The creature knocks the flashlight from Reggie's hand into a puddle on the ground, extinguishing the fire. Meanwhile, Nolan struggles to flip the switch, so Best helps him. Carl manages to take Queenie to a safer place, and when they catch their breath, she remembers Reggie. They go back for their friend, and Carl calls for Reggie, who is in trouble with the creature above him, and something is dripping from the monster's mouth onto Reggie's chin, and it appears to be blood. Fortunately, before the worst happens, Bess and Nolan finally manage to move the large switch, turning on all the lights of the dark hallways. The creature screams and pulls away from the boy, disappearing from sight. Carl smiles with relief as he realizes that his friends found the generator in time. Back in the control room, Nolan and Bess find a small staircase leading down. They are led into a cave covered with newspapers and pictures of the creature that killed Joe. The two also find books and diaries that say someone was obsessed with the creature. Nolan finds a Polaroid of a little girl and starts piecing together the whole story. They hurry back to tell their friends and stop abruptly in a hallway. A shadow can be seen approaching in a nearby corner, and they wait with bated breath to see whose shadow it is. Fortunately, it's Reggie and the others, so Nolan lets out a sigh of relief along with Bess. They notice that Queenie is hurt and rush to her. Carl starts babbling about what happened, but no one can understand what he's saying. So Nolan calms him down while Bess examines Queen's injury. There is a deep bloody cut on her, and Reggie announces that it's his fault for leaving her alone. He also tries to get them to leave, but Bess explains that they can't. The group goes to the control tower, where they observe the body of a rather worn-out man named Julius. Nolan leads them to an underground room and tells them all about the man. He explains how the man became obsessed with the creature, which he calls the Night Nomad, after it took his sister. He reads to them from Julius's diary, and we see the words taking shape in the next scene. Julius, a little boy in a yellow hoodie, is walking through the forest with his sister, pretending they are on an adventure. As Nolan reads the story, we see Julius trying to read and not paying attention to his sister walking toward the entrance of the tunnel ahead of him. The little girl sees something in front of her and freezes in her place. Julius finally notices, but it's too late, as a terrifying scream echoes from the tunnel with panic rising in his chest. Julius takes steps back, keeping his eyes fixed on the tunnel and on what's inside. Another scream is heard from the tunnel, and this time from the creature, making him turn and run as fast as he can. Exhausted, he falls to his knees and cries. Later, we see Julius in a police car looking at his sister's book. The scene changes, and we see a 50-year-old man hugging the book to his chest. It's Julius now, old, who even decades later cannot get the incident out of his head. He enters the tunnel to find the creature that killed his sister with a frightened but determined look. Sometime later, we see him surrounded by candles drawing the plans for a machine he intends to use against the flesh-eating creature. In the next scene, we see him building his project, and while reminiscing about his plans, he draws more inspiration by looking at a photo of his sister back in the present. The friends reflect on the story of a desperate man who risked his life to end the creature.